John chapter 10. We'll start in verse 19. John chapter 10, beginning verse 19. There was again a division amongst the Jews because of these words. Many of them said, "He has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him?" Others said, "These are not the words of one who is oppressed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" At that time, the feast of dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter. Jesus was walking in the temple and in the colonnade or in the porch of Solomon. Now, that might not seem like a lot, but it really is when it comes to what's going on in this text. All right, there's a lot going on in this text. So over the last few weeks, we've been seeing the scenes of John chapter 9, John chapter 10 unfold, where Jesus has healed a man who was born what? Born blind. And this freshly healed man has been dragged before this makeshift council of the Pharisees to examine whether or not this claim was true. His parents were grilled on the stand, and they throw their son under the bus, basically, and the former blind man, seeing the world for the first time, is subjected to this humiliating public scrutiny as he is grilled about who did this, how it happened, and all that. The former blind man actually defends Jesus in front of this Pharisee council, and he says that Jesus' power to heal comes from God, even though there was a very public threat against anyone who would even dare to confess that Jesus was the Christ and what was going to happen if they did. They would put out of the synagogue. So the Pharisees cast the blind man out of the synagogue. Jesus finds him, and the blind man is told by Jesus who he is, and the blind man believes in Jesus. He worships Jesus. And Jesus then explains to the blind man that the Pharisees are blind because they think that they're able to see, yet they cannot see their own sin of rejecting the very Messiah that God has sent to them. The Pharisees, the leader of the people of God, the authorities of Jerusalem, they hear or overhear the rebuke that Jesus just says about the Pharisees to the blind man, and they ask Jesus to reblind also, and Jesus answers this question in the first part of John chapter 10, but with the parable of the sheepfold in verses 1 through 18. Jesus drills home the fact with these Pharisees that they are not the leaders of Israel. They did not have the power to bring in nor to cast out. Jesus was the only door. The Pharisees were not the door. They did not hold the key. They did not hold the entrance. They were not good shepherds because they did not care for the sheep. So if you were one of the Pharisees and you just heard this from Jesus, what would your reaction be? If you were just told you were not a leader, you were a bad leader, and you didn't care for the very sheep you were supposed to be tending, how would you react? You'd be pretty mad, right? And Jesus told them he had the power to lay down his life and to take it up again. Now, what's he talking about? If I tell you that I have the power to lay down my life and take it up again, what power do I have? Sorry? Do what? Yeah, come back from the dead, also known as resurrection power. Now, if you were a Sadducee in this particular bunch, what would that do when it comes to you? Because the Sadducees were Sadducee because of what? They did not believe in the resurrection. So if you were a Sadducee in this bunch, in this public bunch, right, you have the Pharisees who were just told by Jesus, you are not the leaders of Israel. You do not have the power to cast out nor to take in. You are not the door. You are not even good shepherds of the sheep. And now you have the Sadducees as well. And Jesus saying in front of everyone, I have the power to lay down my life and take it up again. Well, who in this audience is not going to be mad at Jesus? All of them are. Now, you know this is a pattern, right? Because in the last chapter 7, what did they try to do?
Kill him.
They tried to kill him, tried to stone him with stones. Back in chapter 5, the exact same thing. They were plotting a way to destroy Jesus. And you remember, they also plotted an assassination attempt. They tried to get the temple guard to arrest Jesus and to bring him to a secret council meeting so that they could judge him and kill him in one fell swoop. But you remember what happened to the guards? Whenever the guards went to get Jesus, they heard him speak, and what did they come and tell the Pharisees? No man ever what? No man ever spoke like this. So you have this constant pattern of them trying to get Jesus to a point where they can get their hands on him to kill him. Now Jesus is standing before a bunch of people in public saying the Pharisees are not the leaders of Israel. And I have the power to take up my life if I lay it down again. I have the power of resurrection. So you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees wanting to kill Jesus. So the reaction of the Pharisees and the Jews that were listening to Jesus in chapter 10, verse 20, was a division, all right? Some are going to struggle to believe in what Jesus is saying because Jesus is saying that he is sent from the Father. He is sent from heaven. He is sent from God. That is a big thing to digest if you see someone standing in front of you saying, I am from God in a physical form. But many of them, when they heard what Jesus said, they thought Jesus had a demon and was insane. Others were getting there. They were seeking, they were questioning, but they would not do this publicly because what did the Pharisees threaten? If anyone were to confess Jesus as the Christ, they would what? Put out of the synagogue. So, Jesus has said all of this stuff, and we see the reactions, and he exposes the Pharisees for their hypocrisy, that they don't have the power to cast out nor to bring in, that they were not compassionate or caring leaders, and the people all around Jerusalem are once again talking about who? Jesus. Who is Jesus? Who is this man who defies the Pharisees? Who is this man who says he has the power over life to raise it up or to lay it down? Who is this person who says that he can resurrect even himself? So the question comes down to it, just like it always does, who is Jesus? It's the question that everyone struggles with. It's the question that everyone has to answer. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus, and do I believe what he says about who he is? This is where it gets fun. In chapter 10, verse 23, we have a scene change. All of the things that happened in this scene, all right, all the things that we've talked about from John chapter 7 all the way up to John chapter 10, verse 22, all those things have happened in a singular timeline and a singular place. All of that happened during the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. The setting changes when you go from chapter 7, verse 2, all the way through chapter 10, verse 21. The setting changes after that. When we come to John chapter 10, verse 22, we are given another feast. Now, once again, chapter 7, verse 2, all the way through chapter 10, we see that this was the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. John tells us now that there is a scene change to what feast? The Feast of Dedication, okay? So, the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Feast of Dedication are 2 to 2.5 months apart, maybe even 3, depending on how long or if Jesus stayed in Jerusalem, all right? We don't know if he stayed in Jerusalem during this time period or not. We don't know if he went somewhere else and then came back. We don't know. What we do know is that there is a 2 to 3 month difference between John chapter 10, verse 22 and John chapter 10, verse 23. So there's a scene change from the Feast of Tabernacles, which took place in late fall, to the Feast of Dedication, which took place in late December. The Feast of Dedication is what is more modernly referred to as Hanukkah, all right? So there's a 2 to 3 month gap between chapter 10, verse 21 and chapter 10, verse 22. So everything that, that was too loud. Everything that happened between Jesus and the unbelieving Jews has had a couple of months to stew. Now, how did Jesus leave the audience of the Jews that he was talking to in verse 21? What has he been doing to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and all those Jews that have been gathered? What was their reaction most of the time when it came to what Jesus was saying? They were what? They were mad. They were upset. Now imagine adding 2 or 3 months to that. How dare he talk to us like that? How dare he publicly refuse that we are the authority? How dare he say that he has the power from on high to raise the dead? How dare he do that? Now, once again, John chapter 5, we see the first attempt that they wanted to kill Jesus in John chapter 5. That's 5 chapters ago. That's months ago. They wanted to kill Jesus. They failed in their assassination attempt in chapter 7. So 2 or 3 months have now passed. This is a long time for the Pharisees to come up with another plan, another instance, another time in which they could trap Jesus and try to kill him. To come up with a plan to execute him and to get their plan so that they execute him in a lawful way so that they are the heroes and Jesus is the villain. Now, I love how the Bible gives us certain cues that change the landscape of our mind. Now, as we're reading, we can see and understand that all these things that are happening are real. Scene changes in stories in the Bible are very key elements that tell us that everything that happened is real, all right? I know that you believe what the Bible says, but when you see it in your mind that these are places with seasonal changes, with all those things, John the Apostle was there. People were there. These were real people. Jesus was really on the earth. So this really happened in the city of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, and God wants us to see this as a real account. When we get to the Feast of Dedication, also known as Hanukkah here in a minute, I really want you to focus in on this though. And for those of you who watched the Devo online last Wednesday, it's kind of a review. Chapter 10, verse 22. It tells you the weather in the Bible. It was what? It was winter. Now, as far as the weather in Jerusalem goes, It is not what we have ever seen when it comes to the last few days. There was rarely snow in Jerusalem. Now, once you got to the higher mountains, they could become snow-capped when it came to wintertime. There was rarely snow when it came to Jerusalem. The only winter, and we would call it winter, we wouldn't even call it winter around here. The winter months were from December to early February. The temperatures during those winter months, some of you would want to move here, all right? The temperature in those winter months was 55 to 60 during the day, 40s at night. Some of you would pray for that right now. They had a very mild climate, kind of like central, even southern Florida, not like West Kentucky, even though Central Florida over the next few days, as you've probably seen, had temperatures in Central Florida that they would never have when it comes to Jerusalem. It was nothing like ours. They did not have hard freezes. Now, if you don't have a hard freeze, what do you not kill? Bugs? You don't kill bugs, but what else do you not kill? Plants. You don't have a hard frost or a hard freeze, you don't kill the grass. So I want you to get this in your mind, all right? We have to remember this is the land of the Jews. Before it was the land of the Jews, what was it called? As they were looking into it from the other side of the Jordan, what is this place called that they're living in John chapter 10? What was that? The promised land of Canaan. This is the promised land of Canaan. This. Where they live now was the promise of God. This was the promised land. I'll give you a description from the historian Josephus when it comes to his observation of this land from Jerusalem. All right? He said this: Judea is the ambition of nature. This is what he calls it, the ambition of nature, that nourishes all kinds of autumn fruits, that preserves the population for the greatest while. It constantly supplies men with grapes, figs, olives, and seeds during 10 months out of the year. Let me say that again. The weather in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem in Judea sustained men with grapes, figs, olives, and seed during 10 months of the year. For 10 months of the year, fruits became ripe during those 10 months. Now, how different is that from around here? A lot. There's a calendar that was discovered dating back to the generation after King Solomon, some 900 years before Christ. It's called the Gezer calendar if you want to look it up. It tells the planting dates and the seasons in the land of Israel, and it describes how farmers began to sow barley and seed crops as early as November, and they would plant vegetation in January. How many of you planted your garden in January this year? Nobody? Why not?
It's frozen.
Have you ever tried to plant a tomato in ice before? Their winter is nothing like our winter. Grasses didn't die in the region, all right? Snowy nativity scenes, it didn't happen. The weather in Judea when it comes to winter is nothing like the winter that we have here. Just one phrase helps us to understand the reality of the scene. It was winter. But the winter around Jerusalem was not like trying to get through 5 inches of snow covered by 2 inches of sleet. The other thing about this that we need to set up is what was going on in Jerusalem. So it was wintertime, okay? Not like winter around here, all right? So we talked about this last week when it comes to interpreting the words like we see them in our culture. When you see the term winter, we define it by what we see when it comes to winter. Winter in Jerusalem and Judea was nothing like the winter that we have here. Now, it was winter, yes. It was cooler. It was not frozen, but it was the time of what feast again? Feast of Dedication, also known as the Feast of Hanukkah. This was a feast celebrated by the Jews that took place during the last weeks of November on our calendar. So it was winter, probably around late December. The interesting thing about the Feast of Dedication, here's my daily double for you. I really wonder if anybody knows this, because it's very interesting. Does anyone know why the Feast of Dedication is so unique when it comes to all the feasts that are mentioned in the New Testament? Okay, anybody but me. All right. The Feast of Dedication was not something that they celebrated because it was written down in the Old Testament law. The Feast of Dedication, the Feast of Hanukkah, is not anywhere in Old Testament Scripture. It was a specific feast remembering the revolt of the Maccabees in the intertestamental period. Now, we've talked about this before. There's this intertestamental period between Malachi and Matthew. Do you remember how long it was? 400 years, okay? So you have 400 years between the last prophet Malachi and John the Baptist basically coming on the scene. 400 years, all right? It's also known as the period of silence because during those years, we don't know of any miracles that took place biblically during that 400-year period. Now, if during that 400-year period there were no miracles and God did not speak through prophets, when Jesus showed up and started doing miracles for the first time in 400 years, would that not get everybody's attention? I mean, 400 years is a very long time. It is longer than our country has been a country. Okay? So, if for 400 years in that particular area, there has not been any miracles or speaking from God through prophets for 400 years, and then Jesus shows up and starts healing everybody, would that not get your attention? Anyway, this feast of dedication, and we have to do a little history here. The Feast of Dedication happened around an event that was about 168 BC, okay? So right smack dab in the middle of the 400-year period of silence that we have in Scripture. Jerusalem is still there. So if Jerusalem is still there, what are the Jews still doing? What do they still have to do? The temple's still there, the gathering's still there. What do they still have to do? All the Jews are commanded to do what? They have to come and they have to sacrifice. During those feast days, they were commanded to make the journey, if they could, to Jerusalem and to do all these. During this time, all these Jews are still doing this because of the Old Testament. Now, I want you to imagine this for a second. It's 200 years after Malachi the prophet has died, and it's about 168 BC, 168 years before Christ. This was before Rome became a dominant empire at all. The Syrians were trying to do the same things the Romans did later, all right? The Syrians were trying to take everybody over and conquer everybody that was around them. The Syrians bordered the Judeans. Let me say it again. The Syrians bordered Judea to the north. If you remember the story we had about Naaman a few weeks ago, the little girl that was taken, you remember that she lived on the border, the northern border? And there were these raids that were happening, right? And those raids were happening by what was called the Arameans. Now, the Arameans are the Syrians. The Syrians would come in and they would take whoever they could take and whatever they could take of the northern border country of Judah. And they would take that back to their capital around Damascus of Syria. So, the Syrian kingdom finally got up the courage or the power or whatever, led by the famous Antiochus Epiphanes. If you ever read about that guy, he's fun. Very bad dude. Long story short, they come in, they take Judah over and Jerusalem over. So the Antiochus Epiphanes takes all this Syrian army and basically just goes throughout the entirety of Judah, through Jerusalem, takes over everything in Jewish territory when it comes to Judah and Jerusalem. He goes to the temple, and you might remember this at some point in time in your life. He goes to the temple. This is 168 BC. Now you want to tell me what he did? Put the pig on the altar, right? So, let me ask you a question. Why would Antiochus Epiphanes go into the temple of the God of the Israelites and sacrifice a pig? To defile the altar, because what was a pig when it comes to the Old Testament? And unclean, something that's forbidden. They didn't eat bacon in the Old Testament when it came to Jewish people. They didn't know what they were missing. But anyway, thinking that he had won over everything. He took the temple, he took the city, he took Judea, thinking he had won everything, right? He then proclaimed these laws to everyone that he had taken over, or supposedly thought he'd taken over, when it came to the Jewish people. The Syrians said, you cannot observe the Sabbath anymore. You cannot circumcise anyone anymore. Reading the Old Testament law was punishable by death. And he placed these Syrian overlords in every single village of the Jews. Now, as the Syrians terrorized the countryside of Judea, the account that we have in history says they came to the wrong family. The family who was known as the Maccabees, all right? If you ever read any of the Pseudepigrapha or the Apocrypha that's found in most Catholic Bibles, it's the Revised Standard Version, but in between you have the books of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees, which is a historical account of the Maccabean revolt. Now, this Syrian overlord that came to this particular part of the country demanded that the Israelite elder that was a part of that particular synagogue and that particular community, that Israelite elder was to sacrifice a pig on the altar that they used to burn incense to God. Now, This Syrian comes and says, you sacrifice a pig on the altar of the synagogue that you worship God on. And one of the city elders went up and started the process of sacrificing this pig. And Mattathias Maccabee killed the priest and the Syrian overlord and fled with his 5 sons to the hills of Judea and started the revolt of the Jews. Over the next few years, the Maccabees would lead this guerrilla-type warfare and revolt called the Maccabean Revolt amongst the Jews, and they would eventually clear away all the way back to the temple, fighting everywhere as they went. They burned all the evidence of the Syrians. They cleansed the temple of all of those that the Syrians left when it came to being defiled. And the temple of God was opened for a feast and for a sacrifice once again. And they held what was called the Feast of Dedication whenever the Maccabees took over the temple once again from the Syrians. That is where the Feast of Dedication comes from. A revolt that happened in 168 years before Christ ever came onto the scene. During this Feast of Dedication, there was a proper sacrifice that was made. There was 8 days of celebration to God. If you remember, when it comes to Hanukkah, there's 8 days of celebration. The 7 golden candlesticks of the golden lamps were lit once again in the holy place that hadn't been lit, since the Syrians got there and defiled everything. Once again, modern day version of what we call Hanukkah. The menorah is what is lit because of the Feast of Dedication. And the Feast of Dedication is also called the Festival of Lights because every Jewish home, when it came to the Feast of Dedication, would light candles or a flame to remember the dedication of the temple being freed from Syrian occupation. So, it was the time of the Feast of Dedication. There's a lot in these phrases. It's a time of Feast of Dedication in John 10, verse 22. They remember how the Maccabean revolt against the Syrians was 160 years before, and how they drove out, the Gentiles from their time, or from their city, and from their nation. And there were these oil-filled lamps and lights that would have been lit everywhere during this festival of lights. Not like Christmas lights that drain the power grid, all right? Just a small flame, all right? Smell of burning oil would have covered everything. Now, once again, the Bible tells you and describes for you what's happening in this scene. It was wintertime. It was during the Festival of Lights. The air would have had a chill. It would have been a far cry from our single-digit weather, a week ago. But to them, it would have been chilled in the morning and chilled in the evening. And at night, you would see the flicker of flames that would have been everywhere, all across Jerusalem. And we have Jesus entering this scene. Sometime during this 8-day Festival of Lights, Jesus makes his way to the temple. Specifically, he makes his way to what place? There's a specific place he goes to at the temple. Chapter 10, verse 23. What was that? Solomon's Porch. The ESV calls it the colonnade, okay? There's a lot being described in this text, a lot of color that we often miss. This description of Jesus walking at the porch of Solomon, it's what is called the imperfect tense, meaning that Jesus is continuing to walk. Now, Solomon's Porch was not that long of a place. Jesus was continually walking. Seems like the text is saying he's going back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth in the same place. Now, this is a very public and beautiful part of the temple. It's a part where a lot of people would be gathered. The Apostle Peter later on would address crowds of people from Solomon's Porch in Acts chapter 3. There would be crowds that gathered in the temple in Acts chapter 5 at Solomon's Porch. So I want you to imagine this scene, all right? It's winter. It's during the Festival of Lights, flames flickering all around, lamps lit everywhere, the smell of burnt oil everywhere. And just imagine you're on the temple grounds and you see Jesus, the wonder worker of Galilee, the guy everybody's been talking about for the last several months. The guy that everyone has been debating over the last several months. Every conversation in Jerusalem has been about Jesus. And you see Jesus on Solomon's Porch walking back and forth and back and forth. What are you going to do? You see Jesus, the wonder worker. What are you going to do? If you are within eye shot of where Jesus is walking back and forth, what are you going to do? You're going to go up and see what's going on. So there's Jesus walking back and forth on Solomon's Porch. I'll give you a description that Josephus gave, all right? Solomon's portico or Solomon's porch is this covered walkway with rows of columns on the east side of the temple. What Josephus says is that it is overlooking the deep valley, probably where the Kidron Valley ran, where the blood of the sacrifices flowed down the hill and the Kidron Valley caught them. Just imagine for a second that you are in Gatlinburg in a big chalet, and you are on the side of this mountain, and you are looking down at this deep ravine, this gorge at the bottom. Where was the temple in Jerusalem? It was the highest point in Jerusalem. Everything looked up to the temple in Jerusalem. Jesus is within an eye shot of no telling how many people as he paces back and forth on the east side of the temple on Solomon's porch. Not only that, it would have been a gorgeous scene. As you looked out over all of Jerusalem, you looked out over the mountains that surrounded Jerusalem, there was Jesus standing there, walking back and forth on Solomon's porch. Josephus describes this porch as being 400 cubits long. Every stone, a square of white. The length of each stone, now just think about this. The length of each stone was 30 feet long and 8 feet wide. You think you could lift that one? 30 feet long and 8 feet wide. It would have been a magnificent structure to see. It would have been a magnificent place to be. And Jesus is now walking back and forth, back and forth. So the Jews, in verse 24, what does verse 24 say? As Jesus is walking back and forth, what are the Jews doing? The Jews gather around him. Jesus walks back and forth. And with each step that he takes, another person joins the crowd, waiting in suspense for what Jesus has to say. We're going to put a pause on this until next week. Waiting in suspense for what Jesus has to say. And the suspense grows. Jesus just continues to walk back and forth. Finally, somebody standing there watching Jesus go back and forth, what do they say? Why do you keep us in suspense? Do you see the picture? Why do you keep us in suspense? Jesus is there on Solomon's porch, not saying anything. He's just walking back and forth. And all these Jews start to come up because they recognize him. They know who he is. Everybody knows who he is. And they say, how long are you going to keep us in suspense? And then we get the real reason for the question. And we'll talk about this more next week. What do they ask? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly. Now that might seem like a good question to ask. But can you tell me why, based on all the things that you've seen happen so far, can you tell me why that question is rigged? Oh, he's told them, yes. But can you tell me why that question's rigged?
Because they want to convict him.
What did the Pharisees say? If anyone confesses that Jesus is the Christ, what? They'll be kicked out. What do you think is going to happen to the person who claims to be the Christ? You might think that it's a good question, but we will find out really quickly that the question was rigged so that if Jesus answered it, they would have a reason to kill him. Which is why, in the answer of Jesus, you see him answer in a very different way. He doesn't just say yes, no, or maybe. He explains to them exactly who he is without publicly saying and giving the evidence to those who wanted to that he is the Christ. It is an amazing conversation. But just getting to that conversation, getting to how Jesus explains who he is, there's a lot of dimension, a lot of depth when it comes to this picture. So I wanted to spend some time when it came to the Feast of Dedication, Festival of Lights, and all of the history behind it, so that we could see this as a real event that is happening because of all of the things that are in this text. So, questions, comments? Anything in particular? Except for Ben. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yep. And just going back to the 400-year point, nobody had seen anything like that during that time that we know of. And then Jesus shows up and not just does it once or twice, but everywhere he goes. And there's no way to deny the fact that he is a wonder worker of Galilee. But to put two and two together to see that he's not only the wonder worker, but the Messiah, like you said, you've got the fear of the Pharisees coming in there, the culture threatening to cast you out. Are you really going to take that leap? Really going to take that punishment of being cast away? That's what they had to decide. Anybody else before Jerry cuts it? Uh-oh, yeah. Yep. What was it in Matthew 24 where they said, we've been working on this for, was it 38 years or something like that? And it wouldn't be finished during the time of Christ. So. Are you talking about Herod? Oh, he was, as far as the history that I read about Herod, he really did not want anyone from Rome to put him under the microscope. And if there were riots and things like that, that's the fastest way to do that. So basically Herod was doing this in order to appease the people that were under him and to tell Rome, look, all the people are at peace. I'm good. Just keep me in here. You know? So there was a lot going on behind the scenes when it came to Herod. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, the end of Pilate was, yeah. All right.